Miss Marple and the seamstress who stitched death into every dress. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the village of St. Mary Mead, transforming Mrs. Violet Hartwell's garden into a picture postcard scene of English country perfection. White linen tablecloths fluttered gently in the breeze, laden with cucumber sandwiches, scones with clotted cream, and delicate Victoria sponges that would have made even the most discerning baker nod with approval. It was the annual garden party and fashion exhibition, an event that had become something of a tradition since Mrs. Hartwell had returned to the village 5 years ago and established herself as the premier seamstress in the county. Miss Jane Marple sat at a small table near the rose arbor, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the gathering with the mild, interested expression that so many people mistook for vague elderly confusion. In truth, her pale blue eyes missed nothing, not the way Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton's smile tightened when greeting Mrs. Hartwell, nor how young Jennifer Wade kept glancing nervously toward the house, nor the peculiar tension in Colonel Bantry's posture as he stood near the refreshment table, nursing what appeared to be his third whiskey. "Such a lovely afternoon," Miss Marple remarked to her companion, Miss Caroline Weatherby, the vicar's sister. "Mrs. Hartwell has quite outdone herself this year." "Indeed," Caroline replied, though her tone suggested she found something distasteful about the whole affair. "Though I must say, there's something rather ostentatious about displaying one's work so publicly. In my day, a seamstress was a tradesperson, not a society hostess." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. "How interesting that you should say that, Caroline. I was just thinking how much Mrs. Hartwell has changed since she came to the village. Do you remember when she first arrived? She was so quiet, almost secretive." Before Caroline could respond, a flutter of excitement rippled through the gathering. Mrs. Hartwell herself emerged from the house, resplendent in a stunning emerald silk gown that caught the light with every movement. She was a handsome woman in her early 50s, with dark hair only beginning to silver at the temples and a figure that many younger women would envy. Behind her came a small procession of village ladies, each wearing one of Mrs. Hartwell's creations, walking advertisements for her considerable skill. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Hartwell's voice carried across the garden with practiced ease, "thank you all for coming to our little exhibition. As you know, each dress you see today has been specially created for the wearer, incorporating not just their physical requirements, but their personality, their essence, if you will." She smiled, a cat-like expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I always say that the right dress can reveal more about a person than they might wish to show." There was polite laughter, though Miss Marple noticed several of the models shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, wife of the local solicitor, wore a severe black dress with intricate beadwork. Lady Ashford Jones displayed a flowing lavender creation that seemed designed to distract from her considerable girth. Jennifer Wade, the doctor's young wife, looked almost ghostly in pale blue chiffon that emphasized her fragility. The fashion parade proceeded with commentary from Mrs. Hartwell, each observation seemingly innocent yet carrying an undercurrent that made Miss Marple's fingers tighten on her knitting. When she described Mrs. Pemberton's dress as perfect for a woman who keeps secrets close to her heart, the solicitor's wife went rigid when she noted that Lady Ashford Jones's gown was designed to create illusions where reality disappoints. The elderly lady's face flushed crimson. It was when Mrs. Hartwell presented Mrs. Angela Morrison's dresser, striking red silk with black accents, that the atmosphere truly shifted, and Here we have dear Angela, Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I designed this dress to reflect her passionate nature. Red for ardor, black for, well, shall we say, for discretion regarding one's passions. Mrs. Morrison, a pretty woman in her 30s with auburn hair, stood frozen on the lawn. Her husband, James Morrison, the local bank manager, rose from his seat, his face darkening. Violet, I think that's quite enough. Oh, James, don't be tedious, Mrs. Hartwell laughed. We're all friends here, aren't we? We all know each other's little peculiarities. Her gaze swept across the audience, lingering meaningfully on various faces. That's what makes village life so delightful. No secrets, really. Not when you're invited into everyone's homes, take their measurements, see their bedrooms, hear their conversations. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Miss Marple watched as several people exchanged glances, worried, angry, fearful. Colonel Bantry had gone quite pale. Dr. Wade looked as though he might be sick. Even the usually unflappable Lady Ashford-Jones seemed shaken. It was then that Mrs. Hartwell stumbled at first. It seemed merely a misstep on the uneven lawn. But then her hand went to her throat, and her face contorted with pain. I can't, she gasped, her voice strangled. Dr. Wade rushed forward, but Mrs. Hartwell collapsed before he could reach her. Her body convulsed once, twice, and then went terribly still. The emerald dress spread around her like a pool of dark water, in the chaos that followed the screams. The frantic attempts at revival, the desperate telephone call to the police. Miss Marple sat very still in her chair by the rose arbor. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap as she observed the reactions of everyone present. Some were shocked, some horrified, but more than one face showed something else entirely. Relief. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead was alive with gossip. The village shop served as the primary venue for speculation, with Mrs. Price, the shopkeeper, acting as both distributor of news and collector of theories. Miss Marple arrived at her usual time, ostensibly to purchase wool for her knitting, but in reality to observe the human drama unfolding. Poison. They're saying, Mrs. Price whispered dramatically as she measured out Miss Marple's wool. Inspector Slack came down from Much Benham last night. They've taken the body away for examination, but Dr. Wade said he's never seen anything like it. The way she clutched at her throat. Dreadful, murmured Miss Marple. Simply dreadful. And at her own party, too. Well, Mrs. Price leaned forward conspiratorially. I hate to speak ill of the dead, but Violet Hartwell wasn't exactly beloved, was she? That performance yesterday, practically accusing half the village of scandal and impropriety. I'm not surprised someone decided they'd had enough. The shop door chimed, and Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton entered. She looked haggard, her usually immaculate appearance marred by shadows under her eyes and uncombed hair tucked hastily under a hat. Mrs. Pemberton. Mrs. Price greeted her with poorly concealed eagerness. How are you bearing up? Such a shock for you, being there and wearing one of her dresses when it happened. It was horrible, Mrs. Pemberton said shortly, selecting items with shaking hands. Absolutely horrible. I've had the dress burned. I couldn't bear to look at it. Burned. Miss Marple's tone was mild, curious. What a pity. It was such beautiful workmanship. Mrs. Pemberton's hands stilled. I don't care about the workmanship, Miss Marple. That woman, she knew things. Things she had no right to know. Things she had no right to hint at publicly. Her voice dropped to a fierce whisper. I won't pretend to mourn her. After Mrs. Pemberton left, clutching her purchases, Mrs. Price shook her head. There's your murderer, if you ask me. Everyone knows Dorothy Pemberton's husband has been, well, let's just say he's been seen leaving the King's Arms with that barmaid more than once. Violet probably knew all about it. She did alterations for the barmaid, you know. Dorothy must have been terrified her marriage would become public scandal. Miss Marple made a non-committal sound and paid for her wool. As she left the shop, she encountered Colonel Bantry, who seemed to be debating whether to enter or flee. Miss Marple, he acknowledged gruffly. Terrible business yesterday. Indeed, Colonel. I hope Mrs. Bantry is recovering from the shock. Dolly's made of stern stuff, he said, but his eyes were troubled. Look here, Miss Marple, you're a sensible woman. People are already talking, making wild accusations. The police will be questioning everyone who was there. I just want to say, whatever Violet Hartwell implied yesterday, there was nothing to it. Nothing at all. Of course not, Colonel, Miss Marple said gently. I'm sure Inspector Slack will focus on facts rather than insinuations. But as she walked home, Miss Marple reflected that Violet Hartwell's insinuations had been very pointed indeed. The Colonel had been sweating profusely during the fashion show, particularly when Mrs. Hartwell mentioned something about officers and gentlemen knowing how to keep their uniforms pristine, no matter what mud they'd waded through. A curious turn of phrase, that dot by afternoon. The entire village had heard that Inspector Slack had officially declared Mrs. Hartwell's death a murder. Cyanide poisoning, someone said. Quick acting and deadly. The question was, how had it been administered? Miss Marple received a visit from her nephew, the novelist Raymond West, who had happened to be staying in the area. He found her in her garden, apparently absorbed in deadheading roses, but in reality arranging her thoughts. Aunt Jane, you were there when it happened, he said without preamble. What did you see? What did I see? Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. I saw a woman who had made herself dangerous. Mrs. Hartwell knew everyone's secrets. She'd been in their homes, their bedrooms, their private spaces. She'd heard conversations, seen evidence of things people wanted hidden. And yesterday, she decided to weaponize that knowledge. But who killed her? Well, Raymond, that's the question, isn't it? There were at least a dozen people with motive. The difficulty will be determining who had the opportunity and the means. She snipped a spent bloom with decisive precision. Though I must say, there was something odd about those dresses. The dresses? Yes, dear. Mrs. Hartwell said she'd designed each one to reflect something about the wearer. But I wonder, what if she'd sewn something more than symbolism into the fabric? Raymond looked puzzled, but Miss Marple simply smiled and returned to her roses, her mind turning over the pieces of the puzzle like the colored glass in a kaleidoscope, waiting for the pattern to emerge. Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage the next morning with the determined air of a man who believed he had already solved the case but was obligated to go through the motions of a proper investigation. He was a large, florid man who had never quite forgiven Miss Marple for solving several cases before he had, though he would never admit to such petty feelings. Miss Marple, he began formally, settling into her sitting-room chair with reluctance, as if expecting it to be uncomfortable. I understand you were present at the garden party when Mrs. Hartwell collapsed. Indeed, Inspector. A terrible tragedy. Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands. Have you determined the cause of death? Cyanide poisoning, Slack said bluntly, then seemed to regret his candor. Not that we're sharing that information widely, you understand. The symptoms were unmistakable, the way she clutched at her throat, the rapidity of death, the slight smell of bitter almonds that Dr. Wade detected. The post-mortem confirmed it. How dreadful, and how was it administered? Slack shifted uncomfortably. That's what we're trying to determine. She ate and drank the same things as everyone else at the party. We've tested everything, the food, the beverages, even the wine. Nothing, which means it must have been administered to her specifically, somehow, in a way that affected only her. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Tell me, Inspector, have you examined the dress she was wearing? The dress? What would a dress have to do with anything? Perhaps nothing, but Mrs. Hartwell was very particular about her dresses. She made them herself, you see, and she told everyone that afternoon that each dress was specially designed to reveal something about the wearer. Miss Marple's expression was innocent, but her eyes were sharp. She also said something rather odd, that she stitched something special into each creation. Slack's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting the poison was in the dress somehow? I'm not suggesting anything, Inspector. Merely observing. But cyanide can be absorbed through the skin, can't it? Particularly if one is perspiring on a warm afternoon, and if the fabric has been treated with certain substances. The inspector set down his teacup with a clatter. By George, Miss Marple, I believe you may have something there. He pulled out his notebook. Now, let me have your account of the afternoon. Who was present? What you observed? Any unusual behavior? Miss Marple proceeded to give a detailed account, her memory remarkably precise. She described the tension in the air, the pointed comments Mrs. Hartwell had made about various villagers, and the reactions she had observed. Mrs. Pemberton seemed particularly distressed, she noted, as did Colonel Bantry, Lady Ashford-Jones, and Dr. Wade. Oh, and Mrs. Morrison. Of course, that comment about passion and discretion was quite pointed. Yes, Slack muttered, scribbling notes. We've heard about Mrs. Morrison and Colonel Bantry. Apparently, they were seen together last month at the railway station in Much Benham. Mrs. Hartwell witnessed the encounter and made some sly comments about it. To others in the village. How unfortunate, Miss Marple murmured. Though I must say, Inspector, while affairs of the heart provide motive, they rarely lead to murder unless there's something more at stake. More at stake. Money, Inspector, or reputation beyond mere scandal. Mrs. Morrison is married to a bank manager, as you know, and Colonel Bantry sits on several important boards. An affair might be forgiven with time, but if Mrs. Hartwell knew something more serious. Slack leaned forward. Such as, well, I couldn't say specifically, but Mrs. Hartwell had access to everyone's homes. She took measurements in bedrooms, mended clothes, sometimes stayed for hours working on alterations while her clients went about their business. She would have seen documents left out, heard private conversations, observed behavior that people thought was unwitnessed. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their clicking. A dangerous position, really, for someone who couldn't resist using that knowledge. The inspector rose to leave, looking more thoughtful than when he'd arrived. I'll have the constables collect all the dresses Mrs. Hartwell made for the ladies at the party. We'll have them examined for any traces of poison, and I'll be speaking with each person who was present. If anyone's hiding something, I'll get it out of them. After he left, Miss Marple sat very still, her mind reviewing the scene at the garden party. The dresses had been beautiful each, one a masterpiece of design and construction. But there had been something else, something she'd noticed at the time but hadn't quite placed. The telephone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her friend, Miss Caroline Weatherby. "Jane, have you heard? The police have taken all the dresses from the party. Dorothy Pemberton is beside herself. She'd already burned hers. And now Inspector Slack is treating her as a primary suspect. And poor Jennifer Wade has taken to her bed with nervous exhaustion. Dr. Wade is quite worried about her." "How distressing for everyone," Miss Marple said. "Caroline, do you remember what Mrs. Hartwell said about Jennifer's dress? Something about pale blue chiffon and fragility." "Oh, it was dreadful. She said something like, designed to emphasize Jennifer's delicate constitution, though I wonder if she's quite as fragile as she pretends. And then she gave Jennifer this knowing look, and the poor girl went white as a sheet." "I see. And Lady Ashford-Jones's dress, what was said about that? Something about creating illusions where reality disappoints. Terribly rude, if you ask me." Lady Ashford-Jones was furious. "She's been telling everyone that Violet Hartwell was nothing but a common blackmailer dressed up as a seamstress." After ending the call, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. But her mind was far from the simple pattern of stitches. Blackmail, yes, that would explain the poisoning. Someone had been pushed too far, threatened too openly, but who? And how had they managed to poison Mrs. Hartwell so precisely at the party, in front of dozens of witnesses? The answer, she was beginning to suspect, lay in those dresses. But not in the way Inspector Slack was thinking. The poison wasn't in the fabric worn by Mrs. Hartwell. It was somewhere else entirely. And that somewhere else told a very specific story about the murderer's identity by the following day. Inspector Slack had made an arrest. The news spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire, and Miss Marple heard about it from her daily help, Mrs. Dora Bunner, who arrived in a state of high excitement. "They've arrested Mrs. Angela Morrison," she announced breathlessly. Can you imagine? Taken away in broad daylight, with half the village watching. Her husband looked absolutely stricken. Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. "On what grounds?" "Well, they found cyanide in her possession rat. Poison," she said, "for the rats in their garden shed. But Inspector Slack says that's too convenient by half. And then there's the matter of her and Colonel Bantry." Mrs. Bunner lowered her voice dramatically. "They say Mrs. Hartwell was going to expose the affair. Mrs. Morrison would have been ruined of all, cast out of society, penniless. Mr. Morrison controls all the money, you see, and he's a proud man. He'd have thrown her out without a penny." "I see," Miss Marple said quietly. "And does Inspector Slack have any proof that Mrs. Morrison actually administered the poison?" "Well, not exactly proof, but she had opportunity. She was one of the models, you see, so she was in close proximity to Mrs. Hartwell the whole afternoon. And she had motive, the strongest motive of anyone there." Mrs. Bunner paused in her dusting. "Don't you think so, Miss Marple? It seems quite clear-cut to me." "Perhaps too clear-cut," Miss Marple murmured. But she said no more. That afternoon, she received a visit from James Morrison himself. He was a thin, precise man in his early 40s, with the careful manner of someone who dealt with other people's money for a living. His usual composure had been shattered, however, and his hands shook as he sat in Miss Marple's parlor. "Miss Marple, you have a reputation for understanding these matters," he began awkwardly. "I know my wife didn't kill that woman. Angela may be foolish, she may have been indiscreet, but she's not capable of murder. Tell me about the rat poison, Mr. Morrison." He winced. "Yes, that. We do have rats in the garden shed. It's near the river, you see, and they come up from there. Angela bought the poison last month from the chemist in Much Benham. She has the receipt, but dozens of people in the village have rat poison. It's hardly unusual, indeed not. Mr. Morrison, may I ask you something rather personal? Had Mrs. Hartwell approached you about your wife's friendship with Colonel Bantry? His face darkened. She came to the bank 3 weeks ago, ostensibly to make a deposit, but she made certain comments, certain insinuations. She said she had information that might be of interest to her husband. Information about his wife's activities while he was at work. She was very delicate about it, very careful not to say anything directly actionable. But the meaning was clear. And what did you say? I told her that my marriage was my own affair and that I didn't appreciate veiled threats. She just smiled and said that, of course, a man in my position had to be careful about his reputation. That a bank manager whose wife was known to be unfaithful would find it difficult to maintain the trust of his clients. Did she ask for money? Morrison hesitated, then nodded. Not directly, but yes. She suggested that her discretion could be quite valuable, and that valuable things naturally came at a price. I threw her out of my office. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And did you tell your wife about this conversation? No, Angela doesn't know. I didn't want to upset her. The whole business with Bantry, as he broke off, his voice tight with emotion. It's nothing serious. A foolish flirtation, perhaps a few stolen kisses. Angela is bored, and Bantry is charming. But it's not worth destroying a marriage over, and it's certainly not worth murder. After he left, Miss Marple sat in thought. The case against Angela Morrison was circumstantial but compelling. She had motive both to prevent her affair from being exposed and to stop Mrs. Hartwell's blackmail attempts. She had means the rat poison in her garden shed, and she had opportunities. She had been at the party, in close proximity to the victim, wearing one of the victim's own dresses. But Miss Marple's instincts told her something was wrong with this picture. Angela Morrison was being presented as the obvious suspect, perhaps too obvious. In Miss Marple's experience, the obvious suspect was rarely the actual murderer. Real criminals were far more clever about covering their tracks. She picked up the telephone and rang Dr. Haydock, the elderly physician who had served St. Mary Mead for decades before his semi-retirement. Dr. Haydock, this is Jane Marple. I have a medical question for you, if you don't mind. Not at all, Miss Marple. Fire away. Cyanide poisoning. If someone were exposed to cyanide through their skin, through treated fabric, how long would it take for symptoms to appear? There was a pause. Interesting question. If the concentration were high enough and the person's skin was damp from perspiration, psi-absorption could occur within 15 to 30 minutes. The symptoms would progress rapidly once absorption reached a critical level. And would there be any residue on the person's hands? If, for instance, they had handled the treated fabric while applying the poison? Almost certainly, unless they wore gloves. Cyanide is very distinctive. There would be traces. Why do you ask? Just curious, Doctor. Thank you for your help. She hung up and immediately called Inspector Slack. Inspector, have you examined Mrs. Morrison's hands for traces of cyanide? Well, yes, of course. Standard procedure. They came back clean as a whistle. I see. And the dress she was wearing at the party, has that been examined? The red silk? Yes, thoroughly. No traces of cyanide anywhere on it. How interesting, Miss Marple said softly. How very interesting indeed. Miss Marple spent the evening reviewing everything she knew about the case, her knitting forgotten in her lap as she stared into the fire. The pieces didn't fit together properly, and that bothered her. In her experience, murder was usually quite logical once you understood the murderer's mind. But this case had an element that seemed deliberately designed to confuse. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, Jennifer Wade, the doctor's wife. She was a wispy girl of perhaps 25, with pale blonde hair and enormous blue eyes that always seemed on the verge of tears. She appeared even more fragile than usual as she perched on the edge of Miss Marple's sofa. "I don't know who else to talk to," Jennifer said, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. "Everyone thinks I'm just being hysterical, but I know what I saw, and it's been keeping me awake at night." "What did you see, my dear?" "It was during the fashion show, just before Mrs. Hartwell collapsed. She was walking among the guests, touching the dresses, making those awful comments. When she got to me, she ran her hand along the sleeve of my dress, the pale blue chiffon one, and I saw something." "What did you see?" "A stain on her fingers. It was dark, almost reddish-brown, and it seemed to have come from my dress." She looked at it, and her expression changed. She looked frightened, really frightened, just for a moment. Then she wiped her hand on her own dress and kept going. But a few minutes later, she collapsed. Miss Marple leaned forward intently. "Did you mention this to Inspector Slack?" "I tried to, but he dismissed it. He said I was overwrought, that I was imagining things because of the shock. And maybe I've been so nervous lately, so on edge. My husband thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But I know what I saw, Miss Marple. There was something on that dress, something that came off on Mrs. Hartwell's hand. Your dress, the pale blue chiffon. Have the police examined it?" "Yes, but they found nothing. They said it was perfectly clean, no poison at all. So perhaps I did imagine it." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to believe anymore." After Jennifer left, Miss Marple sat very still, her mind racing. A stain that transferred from fabric to skin. A stain that subsequently disappeared. And Mrs. Hartwell's sudden look of fear when she saw it on her fingers. She picked up the telephone and rang the vicarage. "Caroline, I need you to help me with something. Can you remember exactly which ladies wore dresses made by Mrs. Hartwell at the party, and what colors they were?" "Well, let me think. There was Dorothy Pemberton in black with beading, Lady Ashford Jones in lavender, Angela Morrison in red silk, Jennifer Wade in pale blue chiffon, and, oh yes, young Susan Cooper in yellow muslin, Mrs. Fletcher in green velvet, and Mrs. Clement in that rather garish pink taffeta. Why do you need to know?" "Just a thought I had, dear. Tell me, do you know where Mrs. Hartwell kept her workroom? Where she actually made the dresses?" "In the converted coach house behind her property. Apparently, she had it specially fitted out with all sorts of equipment. Very professional, or so she told everyone." "I see. Thank you, Caroline." Miss Marple's next call was to Inspector Slack. "Inspector, I believe it might be worth examining Mrs. Hartwell's workroom in detail, particularly her supplies of thread, dye, and any chemicals she might have used in her work." "We've already done a preliminary search, Miss Marple. Found nothing suspicious. Perhaps you weren't looking for the right thing. Tell me, did you find any bottles labeled with chemical compounds? Anything that might be used in fabric treatment or dyeing?" There was a pause. There were shelves full of bottles and jars, dyes, bleaches, fixatives, all sorts of things, but nothing that seemed out of place for a professional seamstress. Would you recognize cyanide among those bottles, Inspector? Another pause, longer this time. I'll send Constable Polk back to have another look. What exactly am I looking for? I'm not entirely sure, Miss Marple admitted. But I suspect Mrs. Hartwell was poisoned by her own creation, in a way. The dress she wore, that emerald silk, was her masterpiece, made for herself. But what if someone had tampered with it before the party? What if they had treated the fabric with something that would react with her perspiration, or with something else she would inevitably come into contact with during the afternoon? You mean like a delayed action poison? Exactly, Inspector, though I suspect the mechanism was simpler than that. Cyanide doesn't need to be complicated. It just needs to be in the right place at the right time. That afternoon, Constable Polk returned from Mrs. Hartwell's workroom with several bottles that had been sent for analysis. Among them was a bottle labeled Prussian Blue Dye Base, which contained potassium ferrizinide, a compound that, under certain conditions, could release deadly hydrogen cyanide gas. But it was another discovery that proved even more interesting. A small, apparently empty bottle pushed far back on a shelf, nearly hidden behind other supplies. The label had been removed, but residue inside tested positive for pure cyanide solution. So someone had access to her workroom, Inspector Slack said grimly. Someone who knew enough about chemistry to extract the cyanide and use it. That changes things considerably. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes. Inspector, it does indeed. The revelation about the cyanide in Mrs. Hartwell's workroom sent new ripples of suspicion through St. Mary Mead. Inspector Slack, forced to release Angela Morrison due to lack of evidence directly linking her to the poison's administration, turned his attention to discovering who had access to the seamstress's workspace. The list, as it turned out, was surprisingly long. Miss Marple learned this from Mrs. Bunner, who had heard it from the postman, who had heard it from Constable Polk's wife. Apparently, Mrs. Hartwell gave keys to half a dozen people, mostly her best clients, so they could drop off or pick up items when she wasn't there. Very trusting of her, or very foolish? Who had keys? Miss Marple asked. Well, Lady Ashford-Jones, for one. And Mrs. Pemberton. Dr. Wade had one to his wife, was having several dresses made, and he said it was easier if he could fetch them when needed. Colonel Bantry had one as well, though that was ostensibly for his wife. And there were probably others we don't know about. That evening, Miss Marple found herself at the vicarage for a small gathering, ostensibly a prayer group, but in reality a forum for the exchange of village information. Present were Caroline Weatherby, Lady Ashford-Jones, Mrs. Pemberton, and several others who had been at the fatal garden party. I still can't believe poor Angela was arrested, Lady Ashford-Jones said, settling her considerable bulk into an armchair, though I must admit that business with Colonel Bantry was terribly indiscreet. One simply doesn't carry on like that in a village this size. Everyone talks. Violet Hartwell certainly talked, Mrs. Pemberton said bitterly. She made it her business to know everyone's affairs, literally and figuratively. Do you know, she once told me she could ruin half the village if she chose? Said it with a smile, as if it was something to be proud of. When did she say that? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Pemberton flushed. About 3 weeks ago. I'd gone to pick up an altered jacket for my husband. She was in her workroom, sewing by hand, and she just started talking, saying how people confided in her, how she saw things while working in their homes. how she'd become a repository of secrets. She said it gave her a kind of power, being the keeper of everyone's hidden truths. Did she mention any specific secrets? She hinted. About my husband's indiscretions, about Colonel Bantry's gambling debts, about Dr. Wade's problems with drink before he married Jennifer, about Lady Ashford-Jones's son and that scandal in India that was hushed up. Mrs. Pemberton's voice shook. She knew everything about everyone, and she wasn't above using it. Lady Ashford-Jones stiffened. I don't know what you're referring to regarding my son. There was no scandal, of course not, Mrs. Pemberton said quickly. I'm just repeating what Violet implied. Whether there was any truth to it, the conversation continued, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, fitting together pieces of the puzzle. Mrs. Hartwell had been a collector of secrets, but more than that, she'd been a user of secrets. The question was, which secret had proven dangerous enough to trigger murder? After the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple found herself walking home alongside Dr. Wade, who had come to collect his wife. He was a tall, thin man with prematurely grey hair and the perpetually tired look of a country doctor. Miss Marple, he said hesitantly, I wonder if I might ask your advice on a delicate matter. Of course, Doctor. It's about Jennifer. She's become quite agitated since Mrs. Hartwell's death nightmares, nervous episodes, constant fears. She's convinced that she's somehow responsible, though I can't get her to explain why. Have you noticed anything that might explain her state of mind? Miss Marple chose her words carefully. Mrs. Wade came to see me the other day. She mentioned seeing something during the fashion show, a stain on Mrs. Hartwell's hand after she touched Jennifer's dress. It seemed to trouble her greatly. Dr. Wade stopped walking. A stain? What kind of stain? She described it as dark, reddish-brown. But when the police examined her dress, they found nothing. I think Jennifer fears she's losing her grip on reality. Dear God, Dr. Wade muttered. I was afraid of this. Jennifer has always been highly strung, prone to anxieties and nervous complaints. Before we married, she spent time in a sanitarium for her nerves. I'd hoped the quiet country life would help her, but he trailed off, then continued in a rush. Miss Marple, Mrs. Hartwell, knew about Jennifer's history. She'd made some comments, suggested that perhaps Jennifer wasn't stable enough to be a doctor's wife, that perhaps she might have episodes where she couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. I was worried she might spread that information, damage Jennifer's reputation further. Did you confront Mrs. Hartwell about this? I went to see her last week. I told her in no uncertain terms that if she spread rumors about my wife's mental health, I would take legal action. She just laughed and said that truth was never slander. His face was grim. I'll admit, Miss Marple, I wished her harm. I wished her gone. But wishing and doing are two different things. Indeed they are, Doctor. Miss Marple paused at her gate. Tell me, when you had your key to Mrs. Hartwell's workroom, and I assume you did have one, did you ever go there alone, only to pick up Jennifer's dresses? Why, just curious, Doctor. Good evening. As she prepared for bed that night, Miss Marple's mind worked through the web of secrets and lies that had surrounded Violet Hartwell. The seamstress had known about Mrs. Pemberton's husband's affarangula, Morrison's indiscretion with Colonel Bantry's gambling debts, Wade's past problems with alcohol, Jennifer Wade's mental health history lady, Ashford-Jones's son's scandal, and likely more besides. Each secret was a motive for murder, but which one had been strong enough? and who had been clever enough to execute such a subtle, carefully planned poisoning? The answer, Miss Marple was beginning to realize, lay not in the secrets themselves, but in the way they had been wielded. Mrs. Hartwell hadn't just known secrets, she'd threatened to expose them. But she'd made a critical mistake. She'd threatened the one person who not only had the most to lose, but also had the knowledge, the opportunity, and the cold-blooded determination to eliminate the threat permanently. And that person, Miss Marple thought as she turned out the light, had been very, very clever about it. 3 days after Mrs. Hartwell's murder, St. Mary Mead was shocked by another death. Susan Cooper, the young woman who had modelled the yellow muslin dress at the garden party, was found dead in her cottage. The cause appeared to be suicide, a bottle of sleeping pills beside her bed, and a note that read simply, "I can't bear the guilt anymore." Inspector Slack summoned Miss Marple to his temporary headquarters in the police station. "Miss Marple, I thought you should know about this development. It seems we may have been looking at this case from the wrong angle entirely." "Susan Cooper," Miss Marple said with genuine surprise. But she was just a girl barely 20 years old. What could she possibly have had to do with Mrs. Hartwell's murder? "Read this," Slack said, handing her the suicide note. Below the opening line were more words, cramped and nearly illegible. "I only wanted to protect myself. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. Mrs. Hartwell found out about my past, about what I did in London. She was going to tell everyone. I couldn't let her ruin my life here. I put the poison in her workroom, treated the fabric of her own dress. I thought she would touch it, absorb it gradually. I never thought it would work so quickly. I can't live with what I've done." Miss Marple read the note twice, her expression troubled. "This doesn't feel right, Inspector. Doesn't feel right." The girl has confessed. She had motive, some secret from her past in London that Mrs. Hartwell knew about. She had access, she'd been to the workroom multiple times for fittings. And now she's taken her own life out of guilt. Case closed, I'd say. But Inspector, consider the timing. Susan wore one of the dresses at the party, the yellow muslin. If she had poisoned Mrs. Hartwell's dress, why would she agree to model at the same event? Surely she'd want to be as far away as possible. Guilty conscience, Miss Marple. Or perhaps a desire to seem innocent by being present. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said doubtfully. "May I see the actual note, not just a transcription?" Slack reluctantly produced the original. Miss Marple studied it carefully, holding it up to the light, examining the handwriting, the ink, the paper itself. "Inspector, have you compared this handwriting to samples of Susan's normal writing?" "We will, of course, but I think you'll find some interesting differences." The opening line, "I can't bear the guilt anymore," is in one hand, clear and straightforward. The confession that follows is in a different hand entirely. Look at the way the letters are formed. The pressure of the pen, even the ink color, is slightly different. Slack snatched the note back and examined it more closely. "By God, you might be right. But what does that mean?" "It means," Miss Marple said quietly, "that someone forced Susan to write that opening line, then added their own confession in her name. And then they gave her or forced her to take a fatal dose of sleeping pills. This isn't a suicide, Inspector. It's a second murder designed to close the case on the first." The implications were staggering. If Miss Marple was right, they were dealing with a killer who was not only ruthless, but also desperate enough to commit a second murder to cover up the first. "But why Susan?" Slack asked. "Why choose her as the scapegoat?" "Because she was vulnerable." Inspector Dodd Young, alone in the village, with few connections or people to defend her. The perfect victim to frame. And she did have a secret something from her past in London that Mrs. Hartwell knew about. That much is probably true. The killer knew this, knew it would make the confession believable. Then we're back to square one. Everyone who was at that party is a suspect again. Not quite square one, Miss Marple corrected gently. We know more now. We know the killer has both medical or chemical knowledge enough to extract cyanide and use it effectively. We know they had access to Mrs. Hartwell's workroom and to Susan Cooper's cottage. We know they're cold-blooded enough to kill twice to protect themselves. And we know they made at least one mistake. What mistake? The handwriting on the note. If they'd been truly clever, they would have had Susan write the entire confession before killing her. But they were in a hurry, or perhaps they couldn't convince Susan to write more than that one line. So they added their own writing and hoped no one would look too closely. Miss Marple stood to leave. Inspector, I suggest you examine Susan's cottage very carefully. Look for any evidence of a visitor fingerprints, traces of clothing fibers, anything that might identify who was there last night, and talk to her neighbors. Did anyone see someone visiting her yesterday evening? As she walked home through the village, Miss Marple felt a deep sadness. Susan Cooper had been an innocent victim, sacrificed by a murderer who was growing more desperate and, therefore, more dangerous. Time was running out. Before the killer struck again, she needed to identify them and provide Inspector Slack with proof. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place in her mind. She thought about the dresses, the secrets, the careful planning that had gone into Mrs. Hartwell's murder. She thought about who had the knowledge to use cyanide effectively, who had access to the workroom, and most importantly, who had the specific motive that would drive them to murder not once, but twice. By the time she reached her cottage, she knew. The pattern was clear as the pattern in her knitting. But knowing and proving were two different things. She would need to set a trap, a careful psychological trap that would force the killer to reveal themselves, and to do that, she would need help. Miss Marple spent the next morning making telephone calls and arrangements. By afternoon, she had assembled a small group in her sitting room, Inspector Slack, Dr. Haydock, and, somewhat reluctantly, Dr. Wade. I appreciate you all coming, she began, pouring tea with her usual calm efficiency. Inspector Slack, have your men found anything at Susan Cooper's cottage? Traces of a visitor, yes. Fingerprints on the water glass beside her bed, fingerprints that don't match Susan's. We're running them against our files now. But that will take time. I may be able to save you some time, Miss Marple said. But first, I need to confirm something about the method of poisoning. Dr. Haydock, you're familiar with various forms of cyanide poisoning. The elderly doctor nodded. As familiar as one can be with such a nasty business. Then tell me, if someone wanted to poison a specific dress so that it would harm only the person wearing it, how might they do so? Dr. Haydock frowned thoughtfully. Well, cyanide in liquid form could be applied to fabric, but it would need to be absorbed through the skin. That would require the victim to be perspiring, and the concentration would need to be quite high. But there's a more insidious method. If the fabric were treated with a cyanide compound that would release toxic gas when it came into contact with moisture and an acid. Human sweat is slightly acidic, you see. Exactly what I thought, Miss Marple said. Now, here's what I believe happened. Mrs. Hartwell's emerald dress was treated with a cyanide compound by someone who had access to her workroom. This person knew that on a warm afternoon, while Mrs. Hartwell was moving about, giving her presentation, perspiring from the heat and exertion, the compound would react with her sweat and release hydrogen cyanide gas. The gas would be absorbed directly through her skin and lungs, causing rapid poisoning. "That's diabolically clever," Dr. Wade said, looking ill. "And it would leave no trace on anyone else's hands, because the poison was in the dress itself, not transferred to it." "Precisely, Doctor." Which brings me to Jennifer's observation. She saw a stain on Mrs. Hartwell's fingers after the seamstress touched her pale blue chiffon dress. Jennifer described it as dark, reddish-brown. "I believe that was a reaction, the cyanide compound on Mrs. Hartwell's fingers, from handling her own poisoned dress, reacted with something on Jennifer's dress. But Jennifer's dress tested clean." Inspector Slack objected. "Because the substance wasn't poison, it was probably an iron-based compound, something used in fabric treatment. When it came into contact with the cyanide residue, it created that dark stain. Mrs. Hartwell saw it and realized something was wrong with her dress. That's why she looked frightened. But by then, it was too late. She'd already absorbed a fatal dose." There was silence as they absorbed this information. Then Dr. Wade spoke, his voice strained. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting that my wife somehow had a hand in this?" "Not at all, Doctor. I'm suggesting that the killer chose Jennifer's dress deliberately, knowing it would create that reaction. They wanted someone to see that something was wrong, but not understand what it meant until it was too late. It was a cruel manipulation of an innocent person. But who?" Inspector Slack demanded. "Who had the knowledge to do this?" "Someone with medical or chemical training," Miss Marple said calmly. "Someone who had access to Mrs. Hartwell's workroom. Someone who had a secret so dangerous that exposure would destroy their entire life. And someone cold-blooded enough to kill Susan Cooper to cover their tracks." She stood and walked to her desk, returning with a stack of papers. "I've been doing some research with the help of my nephew Raymond. It's remarkable what you can discover in old newspapers if you know what to look for. Inspector, you mentioned that Mrs. Hartwell hinted at scandals involving several people. But there was one person whose scandal she didn't just hint at. She knew about it in explicit detail because she had been there, in London, when it happened." Miss Marple laid out the papers. They were newspaper clippings from 5 years ago, reporting on a medical scandal at a London hospital. A patient had died due to a medication error. And although the death was ruled accidental, there had been whispers of negligence, possibly even deliberate harm. The doctor involved was never formally charged. Miss Marple continued, but the scandal ruined his career in London. He moved away, changed his circumstances, rebuilt his life. He became a country doctor, married a young woman who would provide him with respectability and sympathy, and created a new identity for himself. But Violet Hartwell had been a nurse at that hospital. She knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. Dr. Wade had gone very pale. That's absurd. That scandal had nothing to do with me. The doctor involved was named Wardell, not Wade. An anagram, Doctor, Miss Marple said gently. Wardell became Wade. Simple but effective. And Mrs. Hartwell knew it. She'd recognized you, hadn't she? That's why she made those comments about your past problems with alcohol, except it wasn't alcohol, was it? It was medication errors, covering up mistakes, and finally, that patient's death. You can't prove any of this, Dr. Wade said, but his voice lacked conviction. I think we can, Miss Marple replied. Your fingerprints will match those found in Susan Cooper's cottage. You went there last night, convinced her to write that opening line of the suicide note, probably by claiming you wanted to help her, that you understood she was suffering. Then you added your own confession in a slightly different hand, and you gave her a fatal overdose of sleeping pills. You're a doctor. She would have trusted you. Inspector Slack had moved to the door, blocking any escape. Dr. Wade, I'm going to have to ask you to come to the station with me for further questioning. But Dr. Wade wasn't looking at the inspector. He was staring at Miss Marple with a mixture of hatred and despair. She was going to destroy me, he said hoarsely. Violet Hartwell was going to tell everyone about London, about the patient eye. He stopped, seeming to realize what he was admitting. About the patient you killed through negligence, Miss Marple finished quietly. And rather than face justice then, you ran. And when you were threatened with exposure again, you killed to protect your secret. But it wasn't just your career you were protecting, was it? It was Jennifer. You'd married her partly for love, perhaps, but also because her fragility and her own troubled past made her the perfect wife for a man with secrets. She would be so focused on her own problems that she'd never question yours. And her mental health issues meant that if she ever did discover something, no one would believe her. Jennifer knows nothing about this, Dr. Wade said fiercely. She's innocent. I know she is, Miss Marple said, which is why you tried to use her in your scheme. You treated her dress with that iron compound, knowing it would react if it came into contact with the cyanide you'd put on Mrs. Hartwell's dress. You wanted Jennifer to see something wrong, to mention it, but to seem too unstable for anyone to take seriously. Another cruel manipulation of an innocent person. Dr. Wade's shoulders slumped in defeat. As Inspector Slack led him away, Miss Marple sat down heavily in her chair, suddenly looking every one of her years. How did you know? Dr. Haydock asked quietly. What made you suspect him specifically? Several things, Miss Marple replied. His immediate concern when Jennifer told him about the stain, he didn't dismiss it as meaningless. He worried about what she'd seen. His medical knowledge, which would allow him to use cyanide effectively. His access to Mrs. Hartwell's workroom through Jennifer's dresses. But most of all, his marriage to Jennifer. When you marry someone much younger and more vulnerable, someone with mental health issues, it can be out of love and a desire to protect them. Or it can be because you need someone who won't question you, who will be easily dismissed if they stumble upon your secrets. Dr. Wade chose the latter. The following day, Inspector Slack held a meeting in his office with Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, and several other officials. Dr. Wade had confessed to both murders after his arrest, once he realized the evidence against him was overwhelming. He's given us the complete story, Slack said, shuffling through his papers. 5 years ago, when he was Dr. Wardell practicing in London, he made a series of medication errors due to his own substance abuse, not alcohol, as he'd claimed, but prescription drugs. One of his patients, an elderly man named Herbert Finch, died as a result of receiving the wrong medication. There was an investigation, but Wade managed to shift blame to the nursing staff. However, Violet Hartwell, who was a senior nurse at the hospital, knew the truth. She'd seen him altering records, covering up his mistakes. Why didn't she report him then? Dr. Haydock asked. According to Wade, she tried to, but the hospital administration was more interested in avoiding scandal than in pursuing justice. Wade was asked to resign quietly, and he did. He changed his name, moved to the country, and worked hard to rebuild his reputation. 5 years later, he thought he was safe. Until Mrs. Hartwell moved to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple said. Exactly. She recognized him immediately, of course. At first, she didn't say anything, just watched him, studied him. But about 2 months ago, she approached him privately. She said she'd been thinking about Herbert Finch's family, about how they'd never received justice. She said she felt it was her duty to inform the medical board about his past. Unless he paid her to keep quiet, Miss Marple interjected. Slack nodded grimly. She demanded £50,000 a fortune, more than Wade could possibly raise. He tried to negotiate, tried to convince her that he'd changed, that he was a different person now. But she was adamant. She said if he didn't pay within 3 months, she would expose him. That's when he decided to kill her, Dr. Haydock said. He claims he didn't plan it at first. He spent weeks trying to find a way out, trying to raise the money. He even considered confessing and facing the consequences. But then Jennifer became involved. Mrs. Hartwell began making veiled comments about Jennifer's mental health, suggesting that Wade had married her because he needed a wife who wouldn't question his past. Jennifer became increasingly anxious, sensing something was wrong but not understanding what. Wade says that's when he realized he couldn't let Mrs. Hartwell destroy not just him, but Jennifer as well. Miss Marple listened, her expression sorrowful. She'd seen this pattern before, a person pushed into a corner, making desperate choices that only made things worse. He planned the murder carefully, Slack continued. As a doctor, he had access to various medications and chemicals. He obtained pure cyanide by extracting it from compounds legally available for medical purposes. He knew about Mrs. Hartwell's habit of wearing her own creations to showcase her work, and he knew she would perspire during the garden party. He broke into her workroom one night. He'd made a copy of the key Jennifer used and treated her emerald dress with a cyanide compound that would release hydrogen cyanide gas when exposed to moisture and acid. The iron compound on Jennifer's dress, Miss Marple said, was that deliberate? Yes. He wanted someone to see something was wrong. But he chose Jennifer specifically because he knew her credibility would be questioned. He hoped that if she mentioned seeing a stain, people would dismiss it as another nervous fancy. It was a cruel thing to do to his own wife. And Susan Cooper? Dr. Haydock asked. She was the perfect scapegoat. Young, alone in the village, with a secret past. She'd worked as a shop girl in London and had been accused of theft, though never charged. Mrs. Hartwell had somehow discovered this and had mentioned it to Wade during one of her veiled threats, probably to demonstrate how much she knew about everyone in the village. When we began investigating, Wade realized that if he could make it look like Susan had committed suicide out of guilt, the case would be closed. He visited her the evening of the 3rd day after Mrs. Hartwell's death, claiming he was concerned about her nerves and wanted to prescribe something to help her sleep. He convinced her to write that opening line of the note, telling her it was a therapeutic exercise to express her guilt feelings. Guilt about not having spoken up about Mrs. Hartwell's blackmail. Then he drugged her tea, wrote the confession himself in a slightly different hand, and gave her a fatal overdose. The room fell silent. It was a sordid, tragic story to women dead because one man couldn't face the consequences of his past mistakes. What will happen to Jennifer? Miss Marple asked quietly. She's been staying with relatives in Much Benham. She's devastated, of course, but Dr. Haydock has been treating her. He says she'll recover, given time. She had no knowledge of any of this. Wade kept her completely in the dark. She was a tool he used, Miss Marple said, anger coloring her voice for the first time. just as Susan Cooper was. He saw vulnerable women and used them for his own purposes, never considering the harm he was causing. "He'll hang for it," Slack said flatly. "2 counts of murder. The trial will be a formality." 3 weeks later, St. Mary Mead had returned to something approximating normalcy. The scandal of Dr. Wade's arrest and confession had rocked the village, but life, as it always does, went on. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a mild afternoon, her knitting needles moving with their characteristic rhythm as she reflected on the case. Jennifer Wade had left the village, gone to stay with family in the north. She would inherit nothing from her husband. The law prevented murderers, families from benefiting from their crimes, but her family had some means, and more importantly, they had compassion. She would be cared for. Angela Morrison and Colonel Bantry had both been chastened by the experience. The colonel had settled his gambling debts and had been noticeably attentive to his wife. Angela had ended her flirtation and was working to repair her marriage. Sometimes, Miss Marple reflected, a brush with tragedy could bring people to their senses, the other villagers who had been under Mrs. Hartwell's thumb were relieved to have their secrets safe once more. Mrs. Pem's husband had ended his affair. Lady Ashford Jones's son's scandal in India remained buried in the past where it belonged. Life continued, but Miss Marple could not shake a feeling of profound sadness. Violet Hartwell had been a blackmailer, yes, cruel and manipulative, but she hadn't deserved to die. And Susan Cooper, caught up in events she didn't understand, had been an entirely innocent victim. "You're brooding, Aunt Jane." She looked up to see her nephew Raymond standing at her garden gate. "Raymond, dear, I didn't hear you arrive. I just got in from London. I heard about the case. Everyone's talking about it. They're saying you solved it, as usual." "I simply observed human nature," Miss Marple said. Dr. Wade made several mistakes, but his biggest was underestimating how much people pay attention to small details. The handwriting on the suicide note, the iron compound on Jennifer's dress, his own nervousness when Jennifer mentioned the stain, all small things. But together they painted a clear picture. Still, it must have been satisfying to catch him. Satisfying. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked at her nephew seriously. "There's no satisfaction in exposing a murderer, Raymond. It's necessary. Yes, we can't allow people to kill with impunity. But it's never satisfying. 2 women are dead, a 3rd has been traumatized, and a man will hang. There are no winners in murder, only varying degrees of loss." Raymond sat down beside her. "You sound tired, Aunt." "I am tired. Tired of seeing how easily people can destroy each other, how secrets and fears can drive us to terrible acts. Dr. Wade wasn't an evil man. Originally he was a flawed man who made mistakes and then made worse mistakes trying to cover them up. If he'd faced his past honestly 5 years ago, none of this would have happened. But he didn't. He ran, and then he killed to protect his running. Yes, and that's the eternal tragedy, isn't it? The lie that compounds the lie, the cover-up that requires more covering up. Until finally you've traveled so far down that dark path that murder seems like the only way out." Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. "Do you know what strikes me most about this case? It's that Mrs. Hartwell's dresses were beautiful. She had genuine talent, genuine skill. But she used that talent as a means of control, of gathering information to exploit people. She stitched secrets into her creations, not just fabric and thread. And in the end, that destroyed her. You sound almost sympathetic to her." "I'm sympathetic to the waste of it all. Mrs. Hartwell could have used her talents honestly, made beautiful things and taken pride in her work without needing to make people fear her. Dr. Wade could have faced his mistakes and worked to make amends. Susan Cooper could have had a full life ahead of her. Instead, we have 3 people dead and countless others scarred by the experience. They sat in companionable silence for a while. The only sound, the clicking of Miss Marple's needles and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Finally, Raymond spoke. "Will you write about this case? For your records?" "Perhaps. Though I think I'd rather remember the good things, the way the village came together after the tragedy. How Angela and James Morrison are working to rebuild their marriage. How Mrs. Pemberton has become softer and more forgiving. There's always some good to be found, even in the darkest situations. Ever the optimist, Aunt Jane. Not optimist, Raymond. Realist. I've lived long enough to know that human nature contains both great capacity for evil and tremendous capacity for good. The trick is to encourage the latter and curtail the former as much as possible." She tied off a stitch with decisive precision. "And sometimes that means catching murderers, no matter how much one might wish it weren't necessary." As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple continued her knitting, her mind at peace now that justice had been served. The village would heal, as villages always do. The scandal would fade into the past, becoming another story told in hushed voices. Another reminder of how dark passions could be hidden beneath respectable facades. But Miss Marple would remember the lessons of this case. She would remember that secrets, when hoarded and weaponized, become poison. She would remember that desperation could drive even ordinary people to extraordinary evil. And she would remember that vigilance, patient observation of human nature, was sometimes the only shield against those who would harm others. The seamstress who stitched death into every dress was gone, but her legacy remained as a warning. Use your talents for good. Face your past honestly, and remember that secrets, like needles, can draw blood when handled carelessly, as the sun set over St. Mary Mead, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Miss Marple put away her knitting and went inside to prepare her evening tea. Another case solved, another murderer caught, another tragedy concluded. Tomorrow she would wake to a new day, and life in the village would continue as it always had, peaceful on the surface, but with dark currents running underneath for those who knew how to look. And Miss Marple, with her sharp blue eyes and gentle manner, would continue to watch, to observe, to understand the eternal patterns of human nature that repeated themselves generation after generation. Some things, after all, never changed.